you want it? Cardinal. Poker. With the soft cushion. Confess! Confess! Confess!
When I put on a medieval series or a movie, at some point I expect to cover my ears and close my eyes as a gruesome scene of torture and execution no doubt happens.
Stop it, please, I beg you!
Now these are the moments that burn into our minds and won't let us sleep at night. But how much of what we see and hear on the screen is true, and how much is exaggerated cinematic fiction? As always, I'm not a historian, but a simple audio guy. I'm interested in these topics though, so if you have insights or want to point out my stupidity and mistakes, you can do it in the comments. Also, some of the clips are from fiction stories, not purely documentaries, but still inspired by medieval techniques. So over the years, I have read that the brutality of the so-called European Dark Ages was exaggerated, and it wasn't really that bad. I mean, it was still pretty horrific. However, according to medieval executions by Daniel Cybulski, the punishments weren't acts performed purely because of a bloodlust. Christianity ruled the lands and the legal systems were rooted in the religion. So capital punishment was an opportunity to atone for sins, to show remorse, to endure pain as a reparation, and in the end, find God's mercy. I guess to relate to Jesus Christ's death on the cross, the suffering needed to go to heaven. Well, I was raised a good Catholic and served as an altar boy for years as a child, so I definitely understand the suffering part. Another bit that movies promote is the laughing and jeering crowd, even throwing rotten food scraps at the prisoners. Now, contrary to the popular portrayals, the executions were often solemn and reflective. People in the community, they recognized the seriousness of the punishment and the themes of redemption. So it wasn't like a jolly festive-like event. I mean, there probably were instances of that, but from what I learned, prisoners weren't expected to be mobbed on the way and didn't aggravate the crowd. So not quite a funny spectacle as we are made to believe.
A common practice for those about to be executed to be granted a last, I don't know, something or other.
I believe I was making a point. If you could just be patient.
Alright, even though we use the term medieval, the Middle Ages lasted from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the discovery of the Americas, so about like 1,000 years. And the punishments varied throughout the time and across regions. This is a fun YouTube video, not a history lesson. Alright? But if we were to categorize the punishments, hanging was for thieves, breaking with the wheel for murderers, rapists and aggravated theft, burning for arsonists, which was fitting, heretics, witches and sodomites. Drowning for infanticide, so killing babies, and adultery. Decapitation was sometimes considered an honorable form of execution because it was relatively painless. It was reserved for nobility, for treason and murder and rebellion.
Apportez l'épée!
And apparently the most severe punishments were reserved for the worst offenders like traitors and assassins. We got the list, let's watch and listen to some movies. So dismemberment by tearing apart was a practice used in different cultures. Researching European medieval times, this punishment was pretty brutal, as the criminal's limbs were chained to horses driven in opposite directions. So not a pretty sight.
Do you know why they wrap the bindings all up the arms and legs? For a good, clean break. Seen it done the other way too. Bonds at the wrists and ankles, taking off just the hands and feet. You bleed to death as the one horse takes the lead and drags you behind.
Now I found a case where this execution didn't go as planned. So Robert Francois Damiens was arrested for assassination attempt on King Louis XV in 1757. He was tortured extensively, then drawn and quartered, but the horses didn't do the job.
Let me tell you something, let me tell you something. All right. Let me tell you something, let me tell you something.
And he had to be finished off with a knife. It apparently lasted for hours, with Robert still conscious. Now his friend Giacomo Casanova, yes, this Casanova, who witnessed the execution, wrote that even the executioners were disturbed by it. Now the scenes from the movies show the brutality of this technique, with the sound of bones cracking and the flesh tearing, particularly harrowing.
Repent!
But I think in reality it was even worse, especially when you were close to the event and could hear it. Another particularly brutal device was the rack, known as Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after John Holland, Duke of Exeter, who was the constable of the Tower of London in the 15th century. So it was like a bed-like frame, elevated from the ground. Ankles and wrists were secured with ropes to the rack, and when the interrogators turned the wheels of the handle, would stretch a person's limbs, eventually dislocating the joints. It was used on suspected traitors, conspirators, and heretics.
Up first, the rack, a human stretching device. You can almost hear the joints popping out of their sockets.
Lovely. Now I reckon movies portray this device really well, and just the sound of the wheel, of the rope stretching, and ultimately a person's agony is enough for me to turn my head. Like this scene from the Tudors.
What?
It's not true. It's not true. It's not true.
Impalement in series and movies often portrays the cruelty of this method. Even though the most famous use was by the ruler of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula.
This is the time really when Vlad starts to get his reputation as Vlad the Impaler. And it's one of those names that does what it says on the tin.
It was used in other civilizations, tracing back to ancient times in Mesopotamia or Pharaonic Egypt.
Long pole, sharpened at the end, was inserted into the person's anus and driven partly inside the body.
Also, there were many different styles of this punishment, not just, longitudinal. In movies, we usually see the aftermath of vertical impaling. We often associate burning at the stake with witches, but this form of punishment was also used for wives who killed their husbands or servants who killed their masters. And in some cases, the convicts were to visit scenes of their crimes before being led to the stake as part of moral reckoning. Now, the actual death could happen in several ways. In more merciful situations, the convict was strangled with a garrote before being burned.
In the 16th century, wood. There you are. Now, Henry, come and tell me, what's it like being burned? It hurts.
And even if not, smoke inhalation could be deadly before fatal burns. Nevertheless, burning at stake was both symbolic and acted as a deterrent. Again, it's often very cinematic, and movies show the agony of the victims as we observe the massive fires and listen to the flames and the screams. I already mentioned it, but garroting was sometimes used for burning at the stake. The individual at the wooden post was secured with a neck collar or a rope, and the executioners would tighten it gradually. Which would prolong the torture. Again, the sound of the rope stretching makes it even more harrowing. And we get to see the modern use of this technique in season 3 of Reacher. One of my worst nightmares would be to be boiled alive, which just sounds awful. So the individual would be stripped and put in a pot of boiling liquid, water, oil or tar, sometimes in a cold one that was also then slowly heated to boil. Death could come quickly because of the shock, burns or suffocations. Now in the movies we are spared the details, but there was a particularly horrific scene in Shogun where one of the sailors was boiled alive. We get to hear it, but we also got to see it.
Please! We're just merchants! Please! We're just merchants! For the love of God! Please, no!
And I can't get this scene out of my mind. Ducking stool, first known as a cucking stool in the 13th century England, was a public humiliation device rather than a torture tool. So it started as a wooden chair placed in a public spot where the offender, usually a woman accused of gossiping, prostitution or witchcraft, was tied to and ridiculed by the public.
Dave and Colin, I'm not sure I deserve this. I don't think anyone deserves this.
Prepare to duck a scold.
Oh my God.
Scold!
Ah! Oh, it's so cold.
Now with time, it evolved into a ducking device. So the chair was attached to a long beam, then swung over a river or pond and repeatedly dunked into the water with the convicted person tied to the chair. It would last until the crowd was satisfied, I guess.
But such a plea is not sufficient to spare your life. I want names of others.
I know of no others.
Again.
Now some TV and movies portray it as a sort of sturdy, professionally designed device, but in reality it was probably more like a DIY situation. Whoever watched Game of Thrones or 1999 The Bone Collector knows about the rat torture. So during the Dark Ages it was used as a sadistic punishment when rats were put into a container on the victim's stomach and then heated.
Bet you're wondering what this guy is so upset about. Like, he has a cage of rats on his chest, and they put a little bit of fire on top of the cage. The rats get scared, and then they burrow down into his chest.
So you can imagine what the rats did to escape the heat. Now apparently it was rarely used, but it did exist. The Hollywood portrayal is usually brutal enough. Like, we don't need to test it out in reality. You get the sound of the rats getting more frantic and high-pitched as it gets hot in there. It's pretty awful.
Who?
I never saw.
Who?
I never saw. Please, please stop. Please. It started to.
Who?
I didn't see anyone help him.
Strappado was another interrogation technique. So the victim had the hands tied behind their backs, then hoisted into the air by rope attached to the wrists. Now, you think that's bad enough?
Tied the victim's hands behind their back with a strong rope, and then lift them by their wrists or elbows just a few feet above the ground. Sometimes additional weight can be tied to the victim's feet.
Then the interrogators would suddenly drop them, which would damage the nerves, dislocate the shoulders, and be very painful indeed. Now, sometimes they added weights to their ankles, as if the regular way wasn't enough. I could not find a scene where they show the actual dropping, so if you remember one, put it down in the comments for research. This one is particularly brutal. Disembowelment was a slow execution where they cut the stomach open and removed the organs while you were still alive.
Using the slitting knife, I sliced your stomach wide open. The blood would be pouring over the scaffold board, splashing out because your heart, while you still have it, is pumping away.
In Japan, it was a part of the ritual suicide we know as seppuku harakiri. But the most notable example was no doubt William Wallace, who was punished for high treason against King Edward I. Probably a bit toned down in Braveheart. That's where the sound plays a crucial role, like it aids our imagination of what is happening.
It can all end right now.
In Elizabeth I, they didn't spare any details though. Visuals and sounds together. The red hot poker technique is debated as documented uses are scarce, but its infamy was made with King Edward II, who was killed by inserting a red hot poker stick into his ass.
Oh Lord! Oh God, please!
Damn you to hell!
Now, historians think it was a propaganda rather than a real case, especially because sodomy was a crime itself in a deeply religious society. Now, myth or not, we have plenty of examples of this punishment on our screens where the sound of sizzling metal make the scenes even more brutal. People with money and power always have it better, even when it comes to execution. If you are lucky enough to be a part of the nobility or have a higher social status, you could negotiate for a beheading, which was considered a clean and honorable death. It should be a quick job, right? Either by a sword or axe, depending on the region, and by guillotine in a post-medieval France. Unfortunately, things didn't always go as planned, with the most famous Mary Queen of Scots, who needed 3 strikes, which was omitted in 2007 Elizabeth the Golden Age. Swords and axes made for executions were heavier and broader than standard weapons to generate power.
The executioner's sword performed its bloody work in 16th century Central Europe. Unlike combat swords, this lethal blade features a straight, double-edged cutting blade with a blunt tip, perfect for swiftly chopping off the heads of criminals.
Now, in the movies, we usually get a sort of clean, powerful cut and the head just sort of rolls down. To add drama, we also have the sound of the weapon swing, cutting through the flesh and hitting the wooden block. Now, it definitely wasn't as allowed in real life. But in the saga of the Jomsvikings, based on Icelandic medieval writings, we see that these events could also be quite funny, as Svein Wason plays a last joke on the executioners.
Seafed!
Okay, we are back to more gruesome stuff. Flaying and removing someone's skin when they were still alive was the ultimate punishment. Stripping the sinner from their humanity.
Flaying. Mention of this torture is found in the chronicles of ancient Assyrians, the Aztecs, and ancient China. Skinning was applied to criminals, heretics, and even during ritual sacrifices.
The victim was usually tied to a post or a wall, and their skin was then slowly removed with a knife. It could take hours or even days for death to come from shock, blood loss, hypothermia, or infections. It was extremely brutal even for the Dark Ages and used in the most serious crimes. Sometimes flaying was done after death as a warning to others. Now, I couldn't find scenes from medieval series or movies, but a couple of modern ones show this outrageous punishment.
I thought we could build something beautiful together. I thought we could be family.
The scream mixed with the sound of the flesh tearing is too much. Now, I didn't need to see it. What about the most famous torture device, Iron Maiden?
It is the Iron Maiden, one of the most famous torture devices known to man.
Now, this iron cabin with spikes inside to slowly draw blood is one of the biggest myths of medieval history. There is no solid evidence that it was used, and it is thought to have been invented in the 19th century for medieval museums, for people obsessed with the brutality of the past. We see it on our screens sometimes, so it further solidifies the myth. Well, I can't finish without talking about my ancestors, right? So, what was Poland's contribution to medieval punishments and torture? Similar European devices were used throughout Poland's history, but one was quite unique. Odszczekiwanie pod ławą, or barking under the bench. It was a penalty for defamation and lying, from the old Polish saying, lies like a dog.
You'll be like dogs, Wendell. You're going to spend the rest of your life as one.
The convicted, in front of the judge and the accuser, had to go under the table, curl up, and shout, "I lied like a dog," then bark 3 times. I don't know about you, but I think they should bring that back. When writing this video and looking at movie and TV series scenes depicting these punishments, I had some questions. And the first was, why were medieval torture and executions so brutal? And the second, why did they stop? And I found several explanations, but without diving too deep into this topic, there are a few points that I think can answer both of them at the same time. The first was a religious influence. So the societies saw crimes as sins against God rather than against the community. So torture was a way to purify the soul, sort of repentance. And as Europe became more secular, that kind of thinking went away. And to me, it also kind of makes sense, right? Because even now, some countries that are more conservative and religious do have harsher punishments. In Saudi Arabia, executions still take place. Flogging or whipping was practiced until 2020 and possibly still is, and even stoning is still legal. Another point is the evolution of legal system, and once forensics and modern detective work became widespread, the need for torture to get confessions was kind of hard to justify. And then of course, the Enlightenment, growing moral standards such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and just the public sensibilities played a massive role in changing attitudes to brutal retributions of the past. But to me, a point that makes the most sense is the normalization of violence in the past. So life in the so-called medieval times was harsh, okay? Death was all around. Infants passing early, disease, war, famine. So cruel punishment didn't really shock people. In modern times, in our times, unless you work in like a hospital or as a first responder, you are shielded from death and violence. It's not something we witness every day. And as education, literacy and rights developed, so did our empathy and compassion. Still, I reckon movies do a pretty good job of portraying the hard times of the past. We have to remember that what we see on our screens is not real life. Now, in some instances, hyperrealism takes over and makes the events even worse for drama. In others, brutality and violence are minimized and the camera shies away from the action. That's where the sound comes in and plays on our imaginations. And the screams, the creaking wood, the sizzle of flesh, the stretch of rope. Which, in my view, makes it even worse. But I think you agree that we all learned something today. Things aren't as bad as the media makes us believe. And I'm glad the Dark Ages torture techniques aren't widespread anymore. But I guess we do have the modern equivalent punishments, like cringe on TikTok. Which one could argue is even worse, as it makes us die slowly from inside. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe.